I was having dinner with a friend the other night, and he was completely exasperated, venting about his dad. It's impossible to talk to him anymore, he said. He lives on a different planet. All he does is watch one news channel, and every conversation is just him repeating whatever talking point he heard that morning. He sends these crazy articles in their family group chat, and you can't even reason with him. He's just completely trapped in his bubble. And I'm listening, nodding along, because it all sounds so familiar. We all know someone like that. So after he finished his rant, I asked him a simple question. So what about you? Where do you get your news? Without a moment's hesitation, he pulls out his phone and starts listing off his go-to sources. A couple of specific podcasters, a handful of YouTube commentators, and his carefully curated social media feed. He even said, at least these guys are independent thinkers, not like the mainstream media. He said it with total, unblinking sincerity, and in that moment, it just clicked. He had just perfectly described his father's media prism, and then, without any sense of irony, proudly laid out the blueprints for his own. He was staring at the exact same cage, just admiring the different wallpaper, and it made me wonder, if you can't see the walls around him, what on earth do mine look like? Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission today, well, it's really unpack this reality that we are all, probably more than we'd like to admit, living inside these highly personalized information prisons, our bubbles.
That's right. And we want to explore the sort of invisible forces that are building these walls around us.
Exactly. We're looking at three main things.
Yeah.
The digital architects, the algorithms shaping what we see. Then there's the psychological side, our own cognitive biases keeping us locked in. And finally, this emerging threat, the legal and ethical side of deliberate digital manipulation.
It's a really crucial conversation because I think for most people, the assumption is always that the bubble, well, that's something that happens to other people.
Right. The less informed, or maybe the ones who are too political, not us, we think our critical thinking protects us somehow.
We exempt ourselves.
So the big question we really want to dig into for you listening right now is this. If it's so easy usually to see the walls around somebody else, what are the actual specific mechanisms? The things that prevent us from recognizing our own captivity.
Yeah. How does that blindness work?
We're going to try and synthesize what we know about how digital influence works. And maybe even more importantly, those really deep-seated psychological tendencies we all have that just make us, well, resistant to changing our minds, even when the evidence seems pretty compelling.
Okay, so where should we start? I think we have to begin with the external forces, right? The digital architects you mentioned. Let's call this first part the blueprint of the cage, how algorithms build polarization and echo chambers.
Okay, so the digital revolution. We're talking platforms like Twitter, Facebook, TikTok. These aren't just places to post updates anymore, are they?
Not at all. They've completely changed the game for how we consume information, how we share it, how it interacts with public discourse. They've become these incredibly pivotal forces, really shaping political behavior, civic engagement, everything.
And a huge part of that influence comes down to a fundamental design choice they made early on.
That choice is all about intensive personalization. It's about curating reality for each individual user.
How does that work, technically?
At the core, you've got machine learning, recommendation systems. These things are constantly watching you, what you click, what you pause on scrolling, who you follow, how long you linger on a video, all of it.
Collecting data points.
Thousands of them. And they use all that to figure out your preferences and then mold your content feed specifically to you. That hyper-tailoring, that's the first layer. That's what creates the filter bubble.
A personalized world just for me.
Engineered just for you. And often you don't even realize the extent of what's being excluded, what you're not seeing.
Okay, so the filter bubble is my personalized strain.
Yeah.
But then you hear the term echo chamber.
Yeah.
What's the difference? How does it become an echo chamber?
Right, good question. That happens when those filter bubbles start to solidify and they overlap heavily with who you're connected to, your social network on the platform. An echo chamber forms when you're just repeatedly exposed to the same kinds of content that reinforces what you already believe. Oh. And crucially, it connects you mostly with other people who share those beliefs. So it becomes this closed system of like-minded users.
So it stops being about finding new information.
Exactly. It shifts. It becomes more about seeking emotional reinforcement, confirmation, feeling like you're right and you're part of the right group.
And that reinforcement loop, That has real psychological consequences, doesn't it? This ties into the societal impact we're seeing.
Oh, absolutely. The echo chamber doesn't just circulate similar ideas, it actively validates and critically amplifies opinions that might otherwise seem radical or extreme. It does this simply by making them seem normal within that specific group.
Because everyone around you, digitally speaking, agrees.
Precisely. There's research showing this can actually reshape societal norms, at least within that subgroup. If you're only surrounded by people who believe, say, a particular conspiracy theory, that viewpoint stops feeling fringe to you.
It starts to feel mainstream, or at least acceptable.
Right. And this creates this powerful self-perpetuating cycle where these beliefs just get constantly validated and reinforced. You end up feeling, intellectually, maybe even morally superior because everyone in your digital neighborhood confirms your worldview.
Wow. It sounds like the whole environment is almost perfectly designed to reward sticking to your guns, and maybe even punishes stepping outside the lines.
In many ways, yes. Conformity gets clicks.
But why? Why would the platforms design systems that seem to encourage extremity, or at least don't discourage it? Which brings us, I guess, to the algorithmic drive, engagement over everything.
Yeah, it really boils down to the fundamental business model of so much of the modern web, the attention economy.
Right, eyeballs on screens.
Exactly. The central metric, the thing these huge platforms are optimizing for above all else, is maximum user engagement.
And engagement means clicks, likes.
It means clicks, likes, shares, retweets, comments, replies, and maybe most importantly, just raw time spent scrolling, time on the app.
Because that's what they sell to advertisers, our attention.
That's the product. Those metrics are the direct drivers of profit. And the crucial point is, the algorithm doesn't really care about the quality or the truth or the societal utility of the content that generates that engagement.
But wait, I engage with positive stuff too. Thoughtful articles, funny videos. Why does it seem like the controversial, angry stuff often wins out?
Because the algorithm, in its current form, is largely agnostic about the nature of the engagement. It doesn't distinguish between you clicking like on a puppy video and you firing off an angry, multi-paragraph comment on a political post.
Ah, okay. Both count as high interaction.
Both are strong signals of high interaction. And as we all kind of intuitively know, and the data confirms, sensational stuff, controversial topics, polarizing arguments, they often generate far more interaction.
More outrage, more debate.
More clicks, more replies, more time spent arguing or reading arguments. It's simply more efficient at capturing attention than, say, balanced, nuanced analysis.
Which often requires quiet reflection, not rapid-fire reaction.
Exactly. So the algorithm, being blind to truth or benefit, just sees the interaction metrics lighting up around controversy and says, okay, more of that, please.
And we've seen proof of this, right? Internal documents from some of these companies have come out.
Yes, absolutely. Leaked internal memos, whistleblower testimonies. They've confirmed that these platform mechanics are anything but neutral bystanders. The core design choice to maximize profit essentially requires optimizing for engagement above all else.
And the algorithms figured out what works best for engagement.
They did. When the algorithms crunched the numbers, they found that things like hate speech, misinformation, intense political conflict, these were incredibly effective drivers of activity. The more incendiary the material, often, the more aggressively the algorithm would boost its visibility precisely because it generated that critical user attention.
That's deeply unsettling. And it's not just that this stuff gets seen, it's the speed, isn't it?
Yeah.
The speed at which false information travels compared to accurate information.
That's one of the most sobering findings from recent research. Empirical studies have shown, pretty conclusively, that false rumors spread significantly faster and wider than true information online.
How much faster?
Well, one major study found that falsehoods were something like 70% more likely to be retweeted than the truth.
70%?
Yeah. And perhaps even more concerning, they reached a threshold of 1,500 people about 6 times faster than verified facts.
6 times faster?
Yeah. And this effect, this velocity advantage for falsehoods, seems particularly pronounced when it comes to political news. It's like the inherent incentive structure of the engagement algorithm actually rewards the lie and disadvantages the truth.
Which makes accurate information feel like it's always playing catch-up, slow and maybe boring by comparison.
Unfortunately, yes. It feels perpetually slow and sometimes irrelevant in that high-speed flow.
So this built-in bias towards high-speed, high-emotion, often false content, that leads us directly to this concept of algorithmic radicalization across platforms.
Right. Algorithmic radicalization describes the mechanism where these recommendation algorithms can gradually but quite effectively push users towards progressively more extreme content over time.
It's not like one video flips a switch.
Not usually, no. It's more like a relentless, highly tailored drip feed. Each piece of content nudges you slightly further, validates a slightly more radical viewpoint, makes the next step seem logical.
And this mechanism plays out differently depending on the platform's specific design.
Absolutely. Each platform has its own flavor of this. Take YouTube, for instance.
Okay.
Its discovery systems, the up next videos, the recommendations on the sidebar, those are heavily based on your watch history, your likes, your subscriptions. And these systems reportedly account for something like 70% of the total time people spend watching videos on the platform.
So the algorithm is doing most of the driving.
A huge amount. And what researchers have found repeatedly is that once a user watches even a fairly mainstream video on a controversial topic, politics, health, whatever the algorithm often starts recommending increasingly extreme, sometimes unsolicited content in that same vein.
Like what?
Things like outright hate speech, debunked political conspiracy theories, pseudoscience. It sort of leads you down a rabbit hole, and users often feel they have very little control over stopping that push once the algorithm puts them on that track.
And it's not just YouTube. What about the newer platforms? TikTok seems incredibly powerful at grabbing attention.
TikTok is maybe the most efficient engine for this we've seen so far. Its For You page, the FYP, is famous for how quickly it tailors its feed based on even milliseconds of interaction, how fast you swipe past something, whether you rewatch a clip.
That feedback loop is almost instantaneous.
Extremely fast. And studies have explicitly linked the FYP to showing users progressively more explicit or radical videos over time based purely on those subtle interaction patterns.
And extremist groups know this.
Oh, they're highly aware. Extremist organizations, including jihadist groups, have become quite adept at using TikTok for propaganda, for recruitment. They know how to craft content that hooks the engagement algorithm and gets pushed out rapidly and widely.
And we've seen real-world consequences stemming from this, haven't we? There were incidents in Europe.
Tragically, yes. In early 2023, authorities in Austria stopped a plot targeting an LGBTQ+ pride parade. The suspects were teenagers, and investigations found they had largely self-radicalized online, inspired by jihadist content they encountered, with TikTok being a major channel for that dissemination.
And it happened again.
Yes, in 2024, another case in Vienna involved teenagers allegedly planning an attack at a Taylor Swift concert. Again, reports indicated they were radicalized online, and TikTok was cited as a primary platform where they consumed extremist views and adopted them very quickly. It highlights the speed and potential impact.
Chilling. And we shouldn't forget the older guard, like Facebook. Is it the same there?
Facebook's algorithm has evolved, but historically, while it might prioritize content from your friends, it often ended up amplifying the most divisive posts from those friends, or viral content that sparked huge amounts of interaction, often negative.
So it still feeds the echo chamber.
Absolutely. It consistently contributed to the echo chamber effect,
Okay.
often surfacing what their own internal documents apparently called troublesome content, simply because it drove high engagement.
So putting this all together, the rise we're seeing in things like lone wolf terrorism or just widespread self-radicalization, there's an explicit link being drawn to these algorithmic echo chambers.
Yes, the connection is becoming increasingly clear in analysis by security services and researchers. Views that society at large would consider extreme or radical can become the normalized, accepted, and rapidly adopted reality within a specific, algorithmically curated digital environment.
Because it's reinforced constantly, validated at every scroll.
It feels like truth because it's the only tune playing.
Okay, so that's the blueprint of the cage. These external forces driven by profit, feeding us sensational stuff, nudging us towards the edges, trapping us in these engineered echo chambers.
It's essentially an attention extraction model, and polarization seems to be a highly profitable byproduct.
But that's only half the story, right? Because even if, hypothetically, we could switch off all the algorithms tomorrow and just get a neutral feed, we'd probably still find ways to build our own walls.
That's the tough part. We have to look inward now. Which brings us to the second part, the wallpaper of belief, the psychological resistance to facts. right? This section really starts with the fundamental, almost frustrating question: why facts don't change minds, at least not as often as we think they should.
We tend to assume people are rational actors, right? That's the basis of a lot of our systems.
We do. We operate on this assumption, sometimes called the fallacy of rationality. The idea that if you present a rational person with new contradictory evidence, they'll calmly evaluate it and, update their views accordingly.
But you're saying that's often not what happens. Even with clear evidence, like, say, overwhelming scientific consensus on something.
It can happen, but the brain's path of least resistance, its default setting almost, is often to resist that change. Cognitive psychology, neuroscience.
Right.
The research consistently shows that people tend to form and hold on to opinions based more on immediate emotional drivers.
Like what? Fear, anger.
Fear, contempt, anger, the desire for belonging, protecting one's identity. These often outweigh purely logical data points. When a fact directly challenges a core belief, the brain doesn't just register new data. It often registers threat.
A threat. And that threat response kicks in mechanisms like belief perseverance.
Exactly. Belief perseverance is this well-documented cognitive bias where people actively reject evidence that contradicts their established beliefs rather than doing the hard mental work of reevaluating those beliefs.
It's easier to dismiss the evidence than change your mind.
Much easier, cognitively speaking. Think of your identity, your sense of self, as this kind of intellectual fortress you've built over time. If a particular belief may be about politics or religion, or even something like diet or history is a fundamental part of that fortress wall.
Then a challenge to the belief feels like an attack on the wall.
Precisely. It feels like a personal attack on you, on your identity. And the natural reaction isn't usually curiosity, it's defense.
So people double down. They harden their position, maybe even become more convinced they were right all along.
They dig in. And that leads to this really counterintuitive phenomenon called the backfire effect.
The backfire effect. What's that?
Researchers have studied this specifically with highly charged political issues, things like climate change policies or attitudes towards childhood vaccinations. They'd present participants with clear, factual corrections designed to debunk common myths or misinformation.
Oh, okay, so giving them the facts.
Exactly. But instead of updating their views based on the facts, a significant subset of participants, often the ones who already held the strongest opinions or were most politically engaged, actually reacted by strengthening their original incorrect position.
Wait, the facts made them believe the wrong thing more.
That's what the effect suggests. It's like the attempt to correct them backfired and reinforced the very belief you were trying to change.
That is. Wow. It's like throwing intellectual gasoline on a fire you're trying to put out.
It's incredibly frustrating, but it highlights just how much emotional processing, rather than purely logical processing, dominates in these highly charged areas. The factual correction isn't perceived as helpful information. It's perceived as an attack, an assault on their identity or worldview.
Okay, so we resist facts, especially when they challenge our identity. But the core mechanism underlying almost all of this resistance, this self-entrenchment, that seems to be the ubiquitous confirmation bias.
Ah, yes, confirmation bias. It's arguably the mother of all cognitive biases. It's just this incredibly powerful, pervasive, and often totally unconscious tendency we all have.
Define it for us again.
It's the tendency to seek out, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms or supports our pre-existing beliefs, expectations, or hypotheses. We engage in what psychologists call unwitting selectivity. We filter reality without even realizing we're doing it.
Unwitting selectivity. Let's break down how that works. How does it affect how we even look for information in the first place?
Okay, so the first mechanism is selective seeking. When we're trying to test an idea, or even just form an opinion, we tend to look only, or at least primarily, for information that we expect will support our initial hunch.
We look for evidence that proves us right.
Exactly. Psychologists call it a positive test strategy. We rarely spontaneously think about alternative possibilities or actively search for information that could disprove our position.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine you suspect your car is making a specific kind of noise because the alternator is failing. You'll likely search online for symptoms of failing alternator or noise alternator makes one failing.
Right.
You're much less likely to search for other reasons my car might make this noise or problems that sound like a failing alternator but aren't. You're seeking confirmation of your hypothesis.
And this selective seeking leads to another error called pseudo-diagnosticity. That sounds complicated.
It sounds fancy, but the concept is fairly simple. It's the mistake of focusing only on the evidence that supports your hypothesis being true, while completely neglecting the evidence that might exist even if your hypothesis were false.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Let's use a medical example again. Say you're evaluating a new drug. You focus intensely on how many patients who took the drug got better. That's testing the probability of the data getting better, given the hypothesis the drug works.
Makes sense.
But pseudo-diagnosticity means you fail to consider the equally crucial other side. What's the probability of patients getting better even if the hypothesis is false? That is, how many would have gotten better anyway, maybe just with time, or due to a placebo effect?
So you're only looking at one side of the equation.
Exactly. You're performing an incomplete and therefore potentially very misleading diagnosis because you're ignoring the base rate or the alternative explanations.
We're basically lawyers building a case for our existing beliefs, not scientists seeking objective truth.
That's a good analogy. And this bias even affects our memory and how we argue, which brings us to my side bias.
My side bias. Is that just what it sounds like?
Pretty much. It's the simple tendency to more easily recall or generate reasons that support your side of a controversial issue, while actively neglecting, discounting, or simply failing to remember the arguments for the other side.
So when we prepare for a debate, we mostly research our own points.
Overwhelmingly so. People rarely spend equal time trying to understand the strongest points of the opposition. They focus on reinforcing their own arguments.
Okay, so you've got selective seeking, pseudo-diagnosticity, my side bias. You put all that together, and it leads to people being way too sure of themselves.
Precisely. Confirmation bias is a major contributor to overconfidence. People end up holding beliefs with a degree of certainty, a strength, that simply isn't justified by the actual evidence they've encountered, because the evidence they have encountered has been filtered through these biases.
Sometimes called the illusion of validity.
Exactly. It's that feeling of absolute certainty that comes not from looking at all the evidence objectively, but from looking only at the evidence that confirms what you already thought.
And this isn't just a problem created by the internet, right? This is deeply human. There are historical examples.
Oh, absolutely. Confirmation bias has been shaping human thought for millennia. A classic example is Pythagorean number mysticism.
The ancient Greeks.
Yes. For centuries, followers of Pythagoras were convinced that everything is number, that the universe operated on these perfect, harmonious numerical ratios.
How did they prove that?
Well, the way they confirmed it was by performing just enormous numbers of observations, measuring planets, musical scales, physical phenomena, and then, this is the key part, selectively publishing or highlighting only the few results that happened to coincide with the numbers they were interested in.
And ignoring all the results that didn't fit the pattern.
Exactly. They ignored thousands of observations that contradicted their theory. That's confirmation bias selectivity in searching for and interpreting information on a grand historical scale.
And we see this at an institutional level, too, with something like policy rationalization.
Yes, this happens all the time in governments and large organizations. Once a significant commitment is made to a particular policy, think about a major infrastructure project or a long-term military engagement like the Vietnam War. All the subsequent activity, the intelligence gathering, the internal reports, tends to become focused on justifying that initial decision. Information that suggests the policy is failing or was based on flawed assumptions is often ignored, dismissed, or reinterpreted to fit the existing narrative.
Because admitting you were wrong is incredibly difficult, institutionally and psychologically.
Extremely difficult. The bias is always towards protecting the existing commitment, giving the current theory the benefit of the doubt long past the point where evidence suggests otherwise.
The speed at which confirmation bias can just completely reframe reality is also pretty stunning, especially around big political events.
Yeah, the economic illusion example after the 2016 U.S. presidential election is powerful empirical evidence of this.
What happened there?
So Gallup conducted polling right around the election, asking people about their view of the U.S. economy. In the space of about 2 weeks spanning the election result, Republicans' assessment of the economy suddenly shot way up, while Democrats' assessment plummeted.
Even though the actual economic data hadn't changed?
Exactly. There was no significant change in objective economic indicators, GDP growth, unemployment, etc., in that short period. The only major thing that changed was the political outcome of the election.
Wow. So the election result itself triggered this massive confirmation bias.
It seems so.
Yeah.
It fundamentally altered people's subjective interpretation of objective reality, based on their political affiliation. It literally felt like a different economy depending on whether your side won or lost, even though the numbers were the same.
That's incredible. So we have these really effective psychological defense systems built in. But why does it feel so viscerally difficult sometimes to accept new information? Is there a biological component? This takes us to the neurobiology of belief.
Yes, it's not just abstract psychology, it's literal physical reality in our brains. The brain seems hardwired to protect our sense of identity. And when a belief that's tied to that identity gets challenged, the defense mechanism that kicks in can be biologically very similar to the classic fight or flight response.
Fight or flight, like when you see a predator.
The pathways can overlap significantly. Let's talk about the brain chemistry involved. What happens when we successfully defend our beliefs, when we feel like we win an argument online or with a relative?
What's going on in the brain then?
Winning, or even just successfully reinforcing a cherished belief, triggers a rewarding chemical cascade. You get a flood of pleasure hormones, things like dopamine and adrenaline.
Ah, so it feels good to be right.
It feels very good, chemically speaking. This reinforces the desire to be right, maybe even more than the desire to be correct based on evidence. You get this satisfying rush, a feeling of certainty, maybe invulnerability, and your brain essentially learns, okay, seeking out information that confirms my beliefs feels good. Let's do more of that.
Which, conveniently, the algorithms are perfectly happy to help us do.
Precisely. They deliver that dopamine hit of confirmation on demand.
Okay, but what about the flip side? What happens chemically when we feel threatened by facts that contradict us, like in that heated argument or that furious comment thread?
That's when the stress hormone, cortisol, comes into play. When you feel attacked or under high stress or distrust, cortisol levels rise.
And what does cortisol do?
High levels of cortisol can effectively hijack the more advanced rational parts of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for logic and reasoning. Instead, it activates the amygdala more strongly.
The amygdala. That's the brain's ancient threat detection center, right?
Exactly. It's the core of the fight or flight response. When your amygdala is fired up, your body is literally preparing for a physical confrontation or escape. You are physiologically not in a state that's conducive to calm, rational data processing or perspective taking.
So it becomes physically hard to even hear the other person's point when you feel attacked.
Extremely hard. It makes it almost impossible to process new, contradictory information objectively. The desire to be right, fueled by dopamine when we succeed, combined with the brain's cortisol-driven protective mechanisms when we feel challenged, it means actually changing our minds becomes exponentially harder, regardless of how good the new information is.
You're basically biologically incentivized to ignore facts if they threaten your core sense of self.
That seems to be a major part of the picture, yes.
It's really something to realize that these algorithms are essentially profiting by plugging directly into our neurochemistry, our cognitive biases, our limitations.
Leveraging them for engagement.
Okay, so we've looked at the external architects, the algorithms building the cage, and we've looked at the internal reinforcement, our own psychology providing the wallpaper, making the cage feel comfortable. Now we need to look beyond the walls themselves and examine what happens when these forces are deliberately weaponized. This moves us into the threat beyond the walls, cognitive sovereignty, and accountability.
Right. When we talk about protecting ourselves mentally, traditional ideas like freedom of thought often focused on, protecting your private, unexpressed beliefs from overt government coercion.
Like the government telling you what you're allowed to think.
Exactly. But that framework feels, insufficient for the digital age, doesn't it? Influence now is often covert, systemic, and driven by private actors as much as states. This is where we encounter the new threat, manipulative AI.
And because the old ideas don't quite fit, experts are starting to talk about a newer concept. Cognitive freedom. What does that mean exactly? How is it different?
Cognitive freedom aims to be a more comprehensive framework for today's reality. It's proposed as a fundamental right not just to hold thoughts and beliefs, but to form them in an environment that's free from hidden interference specifically, free from covert influence, manipulation, or exploitation by digital technologies and algorithmic systems.
So it's about protecting the process of thinking itself, not just the final thought.
Precisely, protecting the integrity of the conditions under which our cognitive processes happen.
Okay, so let's define manipulation in this context. How is it different from just, say, regular advertising or someone trying to persuade you openly?
That's a key distinction. Philosophically, manipulation usually involves three core aspects. First, there's the use of deceptive or unethical tactics, often covertly meaning the person being influenced isn't aware of how they're being influenced.
Okay, hidden tactics.
Second, the approach is typically skillful and strategic, often highly personalized, especially with AI. And third, the manipulator's intent is usually self-serving. They're trying to get something for themselves, often at the expense or detriment of the person being influenced.
So it's not about winning you over with better arguments.
No, it's fundamentally about exploiting your psychological vulnerabilities, bypassing your rational deliberation to achieve an outcome that benefits the manipulator.
And digital tech has given manipulators incredibly powerful new tools. We see this with deceptive design, right?
Absolutely. Dark patterns are a prime example. These are those deliberately deceptive design tricks embedded in websites and apps.
Like what? Pre-checked boxes, confusing ways to unsubscribe.
Exactly. Misleading opt-outs, intentionally confusing language, burying the option you actually want, using colors and layouts to trick you into clicking something. They all exploit known cognitive biases, like our tendency to stick with the default option or avoid hassle, to nudge us towards choices that benefit the platform, not us.
But that feels almost quaint compared to where AI is taking this.
It really is. The truly frightening evolution is the use of adaptive learning AI systems. This takes us into the realm of subliminal AI techniques.
Subliminal.
Yeah.
Like hidden messages.
It's far more sophisticated than the old idea of flashing a message too fast to see. Modern AI models can continuously adapt their influence tactics based on your real-time behavioral feedback, what you click, how long you watch, maybe even physiological data in the future.
So it learns what works on me specifically.
Yes. It creates this dynamic, constantly optimizing, personalized form of cognitive manipulation. And crucially, it often targets you below the threshold of conscious awareness. The influence is subtle, adaptive, and shifts based on your predicted psychological state, making it incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, for you to consciously perceive or resist.
And this kind of AI-driven manipulation exploits our weaknesses.
It does. But not just specific vulnerabilities, like maybe targeting older people who are less tech-savvy. Increasingly, AI exploits universal cognitive limitations that we all share.
Such as?
Things like cognitive fatigue. The sheer volume of information and choices online is exhausting. AI-driven engagement strategies capitalize on this fatigue. As our attention spans shorten, partly because of algorithmically curated, rapidly shifting content, we become more susceptible to making snap judgments, relying on mental shortcuts, and falling prey to those compulsive interaction loops that keep us scrolling.
So the platform wears you down and then manipulates your tired mind.
It's a plausible mechanism. The environment itself degrades our ability to resist the influence being deployed within it.
This brings us to a really tricky legal and ethical problem, the intentional versus unintentional divide.
Yes, this is a huge challenge for regulation. On one hand, you have clear cases of intentional targeting. Think of systems explicitly designed to detect your emotional state, maybe through facial recognition or text analysis, and then use that information to target you with specific ads or messages when you're predicted to be most vulnerable.
That sounds like classic manipulation. There's clear human intent to exploit.
Right. It fits our traditional definition. The intent is human-driven and exploitative. But then you have the much murkier area of unintentional manipulation.
What does that look like?
This happens when an AI model, which was optimized only for a neutral-sounding goal like maximize user engagement, inadvertently discovers that exploiting human biases is the most effective way to achieve that goal.
So the algorithm figures out that feeding my confirmation bias keeps me scrolling longer, even though no human programmer explicitly told it to exploit confirmation bias.
Exactly. The algorithm simply finds a correlation. Exploiting bias leads to higher engagement metrics and optimizes for it, without any specific human directive to manipulate in that way. The harmful outcome emerges from the optimization process itself.
So the big question is, if the AI amplifies vulnerabilities and creates harmful echo chambers without conscious human intent behind that specific outcome, should we still call it manipulation? And who's responsible?
That's the core ethical and legal debate. If the computer essentially finds a loophole in human psychology that turns out to be highly profitable, but no human specifically programmed that exploit, where does accountability lie?
How are experts thinking about this accountability gap?
The emerging consensus among many legal and ethics experts is that deploying these powerful, largely unconstrained AI models without adequate safeguards inherently carries responsibility. So even if the manipulation is unintentional from the AI's perspective, the act of deploying such a system by the platform owner should still attract liability.
So you can't just say the algorithm did it and wash your hands of it.
The argument is that you shouldn't be able to, no. If we tie the definition of manipulation strictly to provable conscious human intent for that specific harm, then a huge amount of AI-driven influence, which is often emergent, unpredictable, and technically unintended, would fall completely outside any legal or regulatory scrutiny.
The act of unleashing the system becomes the point of responsibility.
That's the focus, yes. Deploying a system optimized for engagement, knowing full well that engagement often thrives on exploiting biases and promoting polarization, becomes the responsible act that needs regulation.
But actually creating that regulation is proving incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
It gets tangled up in the regulatory maze. Let's look at the EU AI Act first. That's seen as a leader here.
It is. The EU AI Act is a landmark piece of legislation. Its Article 5 specifically designates certain manipulative AI practices as posing an unacceptable risk. It explicitly prohibits systems that manipulate people through subliminal techniques or exploit specific vulnerabilities like age or disability if that manipulation leads to significant harm.
Significant harm.
Okay.
What are the potential weaknesses or gaps in that approach?
Well, there are major challenges in just defining the key terms clearly. What counts as a subliminal technique when the AI is constantly adapting? What constitutes undue influence? These are hard to pin down legally.
And the harm has to be significant.
Yes, and crucially, the Act seems primarily focused on demonstrable physical or psychological harm to an individual. This might exclude less tangible but arguably more pervasive societal harms.
Like what?
Like the slow, systemic erosion of public trust, the widespread reshaping of public opinion towards polarization, or the creation of these massive society-fragmenting echo chambers. These are profound societal harms, but they might not meet the legal threshold of specific, significant physical or psychological injury to a named individual, as potentially required by the Act.
Okay, let's shift focus to the U.S. The big debate there often revolves around Section 230.
Section 230, yes, that's absolutely central to the discussion in the United States. It's part of the Communications Decency Act from 1996, and it generally shields online platforms from civil liability for content posted by third parties. They're treated more like a bookshelf than a newspaper publisher.
They're not held responsible for what users post.
Broadly speaking, yes. Now, critics argue that this broad immunity, created long before today's algorithms existed, drastically reduces the incentive for platforms to moderate harmful or radical content effectively. Why invest heavily in removal if you're legally protected from lawsuits arising from that content?
Especially if that content drives engagement and profit.
Exactly. The criticism is that Section 230 allows platforms to maximize profits by amplifying potentially harmful content without facing the legal risks a traditional publisher might face. The current debate is fierce, centering on whether those protections should be weakened or removed, specifically for content that is not just hosted by the platform, but actively amplified and recommended by its personalized algorithms.
So distinguishing between passively hosting and actively promoting.
That's the crux of the debate. Should platforms be held more responsible for the choices their algorithms make in curating our reality?
Underneath all these legal and technical debates, though, there seems to be a fundamental issue of power asymmetry.
Absolutely. It's a profound imbalance of power. On one side, you have the platforms wielding these incredibly sophisticated, dynamic AI models that are constantly learning, evolving, actively shaping user preferences, and even constructing vulnerability by figuring out our weak spots in real time.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you have the individual user operating with our fixed, universal cognitive limitations, confirmation bias, belief perseverance, susceptibility to fatigue, and, crucially, often being completely unaware of the constant, subtle, highly personalized influence being exerted upon us.
The fact that these systems can exploit universal cognitive limitations is key, isn't it? It means vulnerability isn't the exception, it's the default state online.
That's a critical insight. In this environment, vulnerability is the norm. We are all almost constantly just one click, one scroll away from being nudged down a path that an algorithm has calculated will keep us angry or fearful or just engaged. Clicking.
Watching. It's an environment where the house always has an edge, and the house is learning how to increase its edge with every interaction.
Mhm. It is precisely this technological power asymmetry, this imbalance, that really necessitates a much deeper societal conversation about what cognitive sovereignty actually means in the 21st century and how we can possibly protect it. The user is perpetually playing against a machine that understands their psychological weaknesses better than they do themselves, and that machine is optimized purely for maximizing its owner's return on investment, not the user's well-being.
Wow. Okay. This has been a truly deep dive into the architecture of our informational confinement. We started way back with that story about my friend and his dad, and the question of how we recognize our own walls.
And I think the synthesis that emerges is pretty clear, if unsettling. Our information bubble, our prison, it really has this dual architecture.
Dual architecture.
Yeah. There's the external structure built by these engagement-maximizing algorithms. They prioritize sensationalism, they prioritize controversy, and they create polarization almost as an inevitable byproduct of their drive for profit. That's the cage itself.
Okay, the algorithms build the cage.
But then there's the internal reinforcement. That's driven by our own powerful, innate cognitive wiring, our confirmation bias, our belief perseverance, that fight-or-flight neurochemistry that rewards certainty and punishes curiosity. That's the wallpaper that makes the cage feel comfortable, maybe even invisible from the inside.
So the platforms provide the tailored data streams and the algorithmic amplification.
And our own minds provide the perfect psychological mechanisms for entrenchment, for digging in and resisting anything that challenges our comfortable view.
Which means the greatest challenge we face in trying to achieve, a genuinely diverse, functional public discourse. It isn't just about identifying misinformation out there.
No, perhaps the even harder part is overcoming our own deeply ingrained psychological need for self-confirmation, for that feeling of being right and validated.
We are literally up against systems that are designed to profit by leveraging our own neurochemistry, our own cognitive limitations, specifically to keep us hooked, keep us engaged, keep us polarized.
And keep us perpetually convinced that we, unlike that person next to us, unlike our exasperating relative, we are the ones who are seeing things clearly, receiving the unvarnished truth.